On a summer morning in 1483, two boys walked into the Tower of London and never walked out. Edward and Richard were 12 and 9 years old. They were the sons of King Edward IV, and the elder boy Edward V was supposed to become King of England. Instead, their uncle declared them illegitimate, locked them in the tower, and crowned himself Richard III, and then the boys vanished. No one knows exactly what happened to them. No one knows when they died, or how, or who gave the order. For over 5 centuries, the fate of the princes in the tower has remained one of history's most haunting mysteries. But here's the thing. In the context of the War of the Roses, the murder of 2 children was almost normal. This was a conflict that saw fathers killed by sons, brothers betraying brothers, and cousins slaughtering cousins across 3 decades of intermittent warfare. Kings were crowned and deposed with dizzying frequency. Noble families were exterminated. The entire ruling class of England was torn apart in a dynastic bloodbath that makes Game of Thrones look restrained. Between 1455 and 1487, England had 6 different kings, some of them multiple times. A quarter of the English nobility was killed in battle or executed. The crown passed from Lancaster to York to Lancaster to York again, until finally a Welsh adventurer with a tenuous claim emerged from exile to seize the throne and found a new dynasty. His name was Henry Tudor. His descendants would include Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. He would create the England that conquered an empire. But getting there required wading through rivers of royal blood. This is the story of the War of the Roses, the real Game of Thrones, where the stakes were absolute, the betrayals were constant, and almost nobody got a happy ending. To understand how England tore itself apart, you need to understand a family tree. Specifically, you need to understand what happened when King Edward III died in 1377, leaving behind a catastrophically complicated succession. Edward III had been a successful king, a warrior who had won great victories in France, founded the Order of the Garter, and presided over a golden age of English power. He had also been extraordinarily fertile. He had 5 sons who survived to adulthood, and those 5 sons had children, and those children had children. By the mid-15th century, England was swarming with Edward III's descendants, all of them royal, all of them theoretically eligible for the throne, and all of them acutely aware of their proximity to power. The problem began with Edward III's eldest son, Edward the Black Prince. The Black Prince was supposed to inherit the throne, but he died before his father, leaving behind a young son who became Richard II. Richard II was a disaster. He was vain, vindictive, and politically tone-deaf. He alienated the nobility, executed or exiled his enemies, and eventually pushed his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, the son of Edward III's 3rd son, John of Gaunt, too far. In 1399, while Richard was campaigning in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke invaded England with a small army. Richard's support collapsed. He was forced to abdicate and was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, where he conveniently died within the year. Henry Bolingbroke became King Henry IV, founder of the House of Lancaster. But there was a problem with Henry IV's claim to the throne, a rather significant problem. John of Gaunt was Edward III's 3rd surviving son, not his 2nd. The 2nd son, Lionel of Antwerp, had died young, but he had left descendants specifically through his daughter Philippa, who had married into the Mortimer family. By strict rules of primogeniture, the Mortimer heirs had a better claim to the throne than Henry IV. They were descended from an older son. They should have been first in line. Henry IV ignored this. He was a successful usurper with an army. Legal niceties were for philosophers, not kings. But the Lancastrian dynasty never quite escaped the shadow of its illegitimate origins. The Mortimer claim was always there, waiting, a potential rallying point for anyone who wanted to challenge Lancastrian rule. For 3 generations, that challenge didn't materialize. Henry IV consolidated his power. His son, Henry V, became one of England's greatest warrior kings, conquering much of France and dying at the height of his glory. Henry V's son, Henry VI, inherited both England, and according to the Treaty of Troyes, France, the Lancastrian dynasty seemed secure. And then Henry VI grew up and everything fell apart. Henry VI became king in 1422 at the age of 9 months. He was the youngest person ever to wear the English crown. His minority was managed by a council of regents, powerful nobles who ruled in his name while waiting for him to come of age. But when Henry VI came of age, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Henry was pious, gentle, and utterly unsuited to medieval kingship. He hated violence. He was uncomfortable with confrontation. He preferred to spend his time praying, studying, and founding educational institutions, including Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, rather than leading armies or managing nobles. These would have been admirable qualities in a monk. In a king, they were catastrophic. Medieval kingship required a strong hand. The English nobility was a pack of armed wolves, constantly jockeying for position, ready to exploit any sign of weakness. A king who couldn't command respect, who couldn't impose his will through force of personality and, if necessary, force of arms, would be devoured. Henry VI couldn't impose his will on anyone. He was easily manipulated by his favorites, particularly his wife, Margaret of Anjou, and a succession of powerful nobles who used their access to the king to enrich themselves and destroy their rivals. Royal patronage, the distribution of lands, titles, and offices became wildly unbalanced, with the king's inner circle monopolizing rewards while everyone else was frozen out. The result was a government that was simultaneously weak and corrupt. The king couldn't control his nobles, but certain nobles could control the king. Feuds that should have been mediated spiraled into private wars. Royal finances collapsed as Henry gave away revenue to his favorites. The English position in France, so painfully won by Henry V, crumbled as money and attention were diverted to domestic squabbling. By 1450, the situation was critical. England had lost almost all of France, the great victories of Crécy and Agincourt undone in a generation of incompetent management. The king's chief minister, the Duke of Suffolk, was murdered by his own sailors on the way to exile. A massive popular rebellion led by Jack Cade briefly seized London before being suppressed. And into this chaos stepped a man with a claim to the throne. Richard, Duke of York, was the most powerful nobleman in England. He was also, if you followed the Mortimer line, the rightful king of England. Richard's mother was in Mortimer, the great-great-granddaughter of Lionel of Antwerp-Edward III's second son. By strict primogeniture, Richard had a better claim to the throne than Henry VI, whose descent came through Edward III's third son. Richard was also wealthy, experienced, and politically capable, everything Henry VI was not. He had served as Lieutenant of France and Lieutenant of Ireland. He commanded significant military forces. He had powerful allies among the nobility. For years, Richard had been frozen out of power by Henry VI's favorites. He had watched as incompetent men squandered the kingdom's resources while he, the greatest lord in England, was marginalized and ignored. His legitimate concerns about governance were dismissed. His claims for expenses from his Irish service were unpaid. Richard began to position himself as the leader of reform, the man who could clean up the corrupt court, restore good governance, and save England from its weak king. He didn't initially claim the throne directly. That would have been too dangerous, too radical. Instead, he styled himself as a loyal subject trying to advise his king to remove the evil counselors who were leading Henry astray. But everyone knew what Richard really wanted, and everyone knew what his claim meant. If Richard of York was the rightful king, then Henry VI was a usurper's grandson, sitting on a stolen throne. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The Queen understood the stakes perfectly. Margaret of Anjou was Henry VI's wife, and she was everything her husband was not. fierce, ambitious, politically astute, and absolutely ruthless. She came from French royalty. Her father was the titular king of Naples. Her mother was the sister of the French king. She had been married to Henry VI in 1445, when she was just 15, as part of a peace agreement with France. The marriage was supposed to end the 100 Years' War. It didn't. It just gave England a queen who would fight for her family's interests with a tenacity that shocked even the violent men of her age. Margaret quickly recognized that Richard of York was the greatest threat to her husband's throne and to her son's inheritance. She had given birth to Edward, Prince of Wales, in 1453, and from that moment, protecting his succession became her consuming obsession. She gathered allies among the nobility men who had benefited from the current regime and feared what York's ascendancy would mean. She worked to exclude York from power and to surround the king with her supporters. The court split into factions, York and his allies on one side, the queen and her supporters on the other. Each side accused the other of treason, of plotting to seize power illegally, of planning to destroy their enemies. Both sides were right, and then, in August 1453, everything changed. King Henry VI went mad. We don't know exactly what happened. The sources describe him falling into a stupor from which he could not be roused. He didn't recognize anyone. He couldn't speak coherently. He couldn't walk without assistance. He sat in silence, unresponsive, apparently unaware of the world around him. Modern historians have speculated about the cause: schizophrenia, catatonic depression, or perhaps a hereditary condition inherited from his grandfather, Charles VI of France, who had suffered similar episodes. Whatever the diagnosis, the effect was clear. The King of England was completely incapacitated. The timing could not have been worse. Queen Margaret had just given birth to Prince Edward. The succession was now at stake. And the king couldn't even acknowledge his own son. The government had to continue functioning. Someone had to rule. And Richard of York was the most powerful lord in England, with a claim to the throne that made him the natural regent. In 1454, the council appointed York as Lord Protector. For the first time, Richard of York held real power. He used it to sideline Margaret and her allies, to promote his own supporters, and to position himself as the indispensable man of English politics. He also released from prison a man who would become his most important ally, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Warwick was young, ambitious, and extraordinarily capable. He was also fabulously wealthy, controlling vast estates in the north and the west of England. He would become known to history as the Kingmaker, the man who made and unmade kings at will. For now, he attached himself to York's cause. Together, they dominated the government during Henry VI's incapacity. But the king's madness, like everything else about Henry VI, was inconsistent. On Christmas Day 1454, Henry VI suddenly recovered. He recognized his wife. He acknowledged his son. He resumed his royal duties, and the first thing he did was dismiss Richard of York from the protectorate. The dismissal was the final straw. York had tasted power and been stripped of it. His enemies were back in control. The Queen was more determined than ever to destroy him. The Duke of Somerset, York's chief rival, a man he despised, was restored to favor and was once again the king's closest advisor. York saw what was coming. He would be marginalized, impoverished, and eventually destroyed. His family would lose everything. The Lancastrians would never allow a potential rival claimant to live in peace. He had to act. In May 1455, York and Warwick gathered their forces and marched south toward London. They claimed, as all rebels claimed, that they were loyal subjects trying to rescue the king from evil counselors. They demanded that Somerset be handed over for trial. The king and court, taken by surprise, retreated to the town of St. Albans, about 20 miles north of London. On May 22, 1455, the two armies met. The First Battle of St. Albans was not a major engagement by military standards, perhaps a few thousand men on each side, with the fighting lasting only about an hour. But its symbolic significance was enormous. For the first time in the war, English lords were killing English lords on English soil in open battle over the succession. York's forces attacked the town and broke through the barriers. In the chaotic street fighting that followed, the Duke of Somerset was cut down, along with the Earl of Northumberland and Lord Clifford, leading members of the Lancastrian faction. King Henry VI himself was wounded a minor injury. An arrow grazed to the neck and was captured by the Yorkists. The king was a prisoner. The Queen and the Prince of Wales had fled. York was, once again, the dominant power in England. The Wars of the Roses had begun. The name Wars of the Roses is actually a later invention. Shakespeare popularized the image of lords choosing red or white roses to indicate their allegiance: red for Lancaster, white for York. In reality, the rose symbolism wasn't particularly important during the actual conflict. Both sides used various badges and symbols, but the name stuck and it captures something true about the war. This was a conflict between two branches of the same royal family, fighting over who had the legitimate right to rule England. It was a family quarrel that killed tens of thousands of people. After St. Albans, York was back in control. He became Lord Protector again. Warwick became captain of Calais, the last English possession in France and a vital military base. The Lancastrian leaders were dead or in hiding, but the Queen was not defeated. Margaret of Anjou had escaped to the Midlands with her son. She began gathering supporters, lords who feared York's ambitions, families who had feuds with York's allies, anyone who could be convinced that the Yorkists meant to usurp the throne. The king remained a helpless pawn, passed between factions, his nominal authority used to legitimize whoever currently controlled him. When York had custody of Henry, York ruled in the king's name. When Margaret reclaimed her husband, she ruled instead. For several years, an uneasy peace held. Neither side was strong enough to destroy the other. The conflict simmered, punctuated by occasional outbreaks of violence, by political maneuvering, by the slow accumulation of grievances. Both sides were preparing for the final confrontation. It came in 1459. The Queen moved first. Margaret had been building her coalition for years, and by 1459, she was ready to strike. At a council meeting in Coventry, she pushed through legislation declaring York and his allies traitors. Their lands were forfeit, their lives were threatened. York and his sons scattered. Richard of York fled to Ireland. His eldest son, Edward, Earl of March, fled to Calais with Warwick. The Yorkist coalition seemed to be collapsing, but they regrouped. In the summer of 1460, Warwick and Edward crossed the Channel and landed in Kent. They gathered forces as they marched north, promising reform and justice, attracting the support of Londoners who were tired of the chaotic government. At the Battle of Northampton in July 1460, the Yorkists caught the royal army in a fortified position. Treachery decided the battle. Lord Grey of Rough switched sides at the crucial moment, allowing the Yorkists to storm the Lancastrian defenses. King Henry VI was captured again. Many leading Lancastrians were killed. York himself landed in England in September, and he arrived with a new demand. No more pretending to be a loyal subject seeking reform. No more claiming to want only the removal of evil counselors. Richard of York walked into Parliament and placed his hand on the empty throne. He was claiming the crown itself. The lords in Parliament were stunned. Richard of York had marched into Westminster Hall, walked to the empty throne, and laid his hand upon it. The message was unmistakable. He wasn't asking for reform anymore. He wasn't demanding the removal of bad advisors. He was claiming the crown itself. And for a long, terrible moment, no one knew what to do. The lords had supported York as a reformer, as a counterweight to the Queen's faction, as the man who would restore good governance. But this was something different. This was usurpation. This was the overthrow of an anointed king. Even York's own allies were uncomfortable. Warwick, who had risked everything for the Yorkist cause, hadn't expected this. The claim to the throne was legally defensible. York really did have a superior line of descent from Edward III, but it was politically explosive. After an agonized debate, Parliament crafted a compromise, the Act of Accord. Under its terms, Henry VI would remain king for the rest of his life. But his son, Prince Edward, would be disinherited. When Henry died, the crown would pass to Richard of York and his descendants. It was a solution that satisfied no one, which is usually a sign that a compromise has failed. Henry VI, characteristically, accepted the act without apparent objection. He seemed almost relieved to surrender the burden of succession. His own son would lose the throne, and he didn't fight it, but Margaret of Anjou would fight. The Queen had fled north with Prince Edward after the Battle of Northampton. She was building an army in the Lancastrian heartlands, Yorkshire, Lancashire, Northumberland territories where loyalty to the House of Lancaster ran deep. She gathered Scottish allies, promising them border concessions in exchange for military support. She rallied the nobles who had lost lands and positions to the Yorkist takeover. And she had one overwhelming argument on her side. The Act of Accord had disinherited a prince. It had stripped a child of his birthright. It was an outrage against the laws of succession that the Yorkists themselves claimed to uphold. Every lord who had a son, which was most of them, could imagine the same thing happening to their own families. If Parliament could disinherit a prince, no inheritance was safe. Margaret's army grew. In December 1460, Richard of York marched north to confront the Queen's forces. His army was smaller than he had expected. Many of his supporters were still scattered across England, celebrating Christmas with their families. But York was confident. He had beaten the Lancastrians before. He would beat them again. He was wrong. The Battle of Wakefield, fought on December 30th, 1460, was a catastrophe for the Yorkist cause. The exact details are disputed, but the outcome is clear. York's army was caught outside his castle at Sandal, possibly lured out by a feigned retreat or a promise of parley. The Lancastrian forces, larger and better prepared, surrounded and overwhelmed the Yorkists. Richard of York was killed in the fighting. So was his second son, the 17-year-old Edmund, Earl of Rutland. According to legend, probably exaggerated, but symbolically potent, Edmund was captured trying to flee and murdered in cold blood by Lord Clifford, whose own father had died at St. Albans. "By God's blood, thy father slew mine," Clifford supposedly said, "and so will I do thee." The Yorkist Earl of Salisbury, Warwick's father, was captured and executed the next day. The Lancastrians cut off Richard of York's head and mounted it on the gates of York City, adorned with a paper crown. "So York may overlook the town of York," Margaret reportedly said. It was a brutal message. This is what happens to usurpers. This is how pretenders to the throne are treated. But Margaret had made a terrible miscalculation. Richard of York was dead, but he had sons. Edward, Earl of March, was 18 years old when his father died at Wakefield. He was not like his father. Richard of York had been cautious, political, constantly maneuvering for position. Edward was a warrior. He was also enormous, over 6 feet tall at a time when the average man was 5'5", with a physical presence that dominated any room. And he was furious. Edward was in the Welsh marches when he heard about Wakefield. A Lancastrian force under the Earl of Pembroke was marching to join the Queen. Edward intercepted them at Mortimer's Cross on February 2nd, 1461. Before the battle, a rare meteorological phenomenon appeared. 3 suns seemed to rise in the sky of Parhalion, caused by ice crystals in the atmosphere. Edward's men were terrified by the omen. Edward turned it into a symbol of victory. "This is a good sign," he declared. "It represents the 3 sons of York, myself, George, and Richard, who will shine in triumph over our enemies." He adopted the sun in splendor as his personal badge. He would carry it for the rest of his life. The Battle of Mortimer's Cross was a decisive Yorkist victory. The Lancastrian force was shattered. The Earl of Pembroke's father, and Tudor grandfather of the future Henry VII, was captured and beheaded. Edward had avenged Wakefield, but the war was far from over. While Edward was fighting in Wales, Margaret was marching south. Her northern army swept through the Midlands toward London, leaving a trail of destruction that terrified the population. The Queen's forces were poorly supplied and poorly disciplined. They pillaged as they went, looting towns and villages, turning the countryside against the Lancastrian cause. Warwick tried to stop her at the Second Battle of St. Albans on February 17, 1461. He failed. Warwick's defensive position was outflanked. His army collapsed. King Henry VI, who had been brought along as a figurehead of Yorkist legitimacy, was recaptured by his wife's forces. London lay open. Margaret could have marched into the capital and reclaimed the city for her husband. She didn't. The citizens of London were terrified of her northern army, those pillaging soldiers who had devastated the Midlands. They refused to open the gates. Margaret hesitated, unsure whether to assault the city or wait for surrender. While she hesitated, Edward arrived from the west with his victorious army. The Yorkists entered London in triumph. Margaret retreated north. And on March 4, 1461, Edward was proclaimed King of England. He was Edward IV. He was 19 years old, and he had taken the throne by force. But the war wasn't over. Margaret still had an army. Henry VI was still alive. The Lancastrian claim remained. Edward had to destroy them. The Battle of Toten, fought on March 29, 1461, was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The battle lasted for hours, some sources say 10 hours or more, a grinding, exhausting slaughter in the snow and the mud. Neither side gave ground easily. Neither side took prisoners. Eventually, Yorkist reinforcements arrived. The Duke of Norfolk's forces struck the Lancastrian flank. The Lancastrian line broke, the retreat became a rout, and then the killing really began. Edward IV returned to London in triumph. He was king not just by proclamation, but by right of conquest. He had won the throne the old-fashioned way on the battlefield. The war was over, except, of course, it wasn't. Edward IV's reign began promisingly. He was young, energetic, and genuinely popular. He was tall and handsome, the most attractive king England had ever had by contemporary accounts. He loved tournaments, hunting, fine clothes, and beautiful women. He was, in many ways, the ideal medieval monarch, a warrior who was also a showman. He worked to restore order after years of chaos. He promoted loyal followers, confiscated Lancastrian estates, and tried to heal the wounds of civil war. He relied heavily on Warwick, who had become the most powerful man in England after the king himself. But Edward had a problem. He needed to marry, and he needed to marry well. A king's marriage was a diplomatic tool and alliance with a foreign power, a means of strengthening the realm's position in Europe. Warwick was negotiating a French marriage, seeking to bind England to France against Burgundy. Edward had other ideas. In 1464, he secretly married Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth Woodville was beautiful, ambitious, and entirely unsuitable. She was a widow with 2 sons from her first marriage. Her father was a mere knight respectable, but far below the rank of a queen's family. Worse, her family had been Lancastrians. Her first husband had died fighting for Henry VI. She was not a foreign princess. She was not a diplomatic alliance. She was a love match, or perhaps a lust match, since Elizabeth reportedly refused to become Edward's mistress and held out for marriage. When Edward finally revealed the marriage to his council, Warwick was humiliated. He had been negotiating with France in good faith, only to discover that the king had already married someone else. He had been made a fool. The Woodville marriage changed the politics of Edward's court. Elizabeth's family, her parents, her brothers, her sisters were suddenly elevated to the highest ranks of the nobility. They received titles, lands, marriages to wealthy heirs. The Queen's relatives became a powerful faction at court, competing with Warwick and the established nobility for influence. Warwick watched as the Woodvilles accumulated power that he believed should have been his. He had made Edward king. He had risked everything for the Yorkist cause. And now he was being pushed aside by the family of a woman he considered beneath contempt. The alliance between Edward and Warwick, the foundation of Yorkist power, began to crack. The break came slowly, then all at once. Throughout the late 1460s, Warwick grew increasingly frustrated with Edward's independence. The king refused to follow Warwick's foreign policy. The king elevated the Woodvilles despite Warwick's objections. The king treated Warwick as a servant rather than a partner. Warwick was not a man who accepted subordination gracefully. In 1469, he made his move. He allied with Edward's brother, George, Duke of Clarence, a weak man who was easily manipulated by promises of advancement. Together, they launched a rebellion against the king. At the Battle of Edgecote, the rebels defeated a royal army. They captured Edward IV himself and held him prisoner at Warwick Castle. For a moment, Warwick tried to rule through the captive king much as various factions had ruled through the captive Henry VI. But he quickly discovered that no one would accept his authority. Without Edward's genuine cooperation, the government couldn't function. Warwick was forced to release the king, Edward returned to power, and for a time, an uneasy peace prevailed. But the trust was gone. Edward knew that Warwick had tried to overthrow him. Warwick knew that Edward would never forgive the attempt. In 1470, Warwick rebelled again. This time, there was no pretense of loyalty. This time, Warwick fled to France and made an alliance that shocked the world. He allied with Margaret of Anjou. The kingmaker was now making kings for the other side. It was an extraordinary reversal. Warwick had spent 15 years fighting the Lancastrians. He had helped destroy their armies, kill their leaders, and drive their king into exile. Now he was embracing the queen he had worked so hard to defeat. Margaret was initially reluctant. Warwick had called her every name imaginable, had accused her of adultery, had tried to bastardize her son. But the French king, Louis XI, brokered the alliance. Margaret needed Warwick's military power. Warwick needed Lancastrian legitimacy. They agreed that Henry VI would be restored to the throne. Warwick's daughter would marry Prince Edward, making Warwick the father-in-law of the future king. The Yorkist regime would be destroyed, and Warwick would be more powerful than ever. In September 1470, Warwick landed in England with an army. Edward IV, caught by surprise and with insufficient forces, was forced to flee. He escaped to Burgundy with a handful of followers, including his youngest brother, Richard of Gloucester. Henry VI was brought out of the Tower of London, where he had been imprisoned for years. The poor man was barely coherent. His mental illness had worsened during his captivity, but he was dressed in royal robes and paraded through the streets of London. The readeption, as it was called, had begun. Henry VI was king again. Edward IV was a fugitive. But Edward had no intention of staying a fugitive. Edward IV spent the winter of 1470 to 1471 at the court of Burgundy. His brother-in-law, Charles the Bold, was initially reluctant to help. Charles was trying to stay neutral in the English conflicts. But Louis XI's support for the readeption threatened Burgundian interests. Eventually, Charles provided money, ships, and troops. In March 1471, Edward landed in Yorkshire with a small force. What followed was one of the most remarkable military comebacks in English history. Edward marched south, gathering supporters as he went. He claimed initially that he had returned only to reclaim his Duchy of York, not the throne. It was a transparent fiction, but it gave waverers an excuse to join him. The crucial moment came when Edward confronted his brother George, Duke of Clarence. Clarence had switched sides to join Warwick's rebellion. He had expected to be made heir to the throne in place of Henry VI's son. When Warwick instead married his daughter to Prince Edward, Clarence realized he had been played. Edward offered his brother a deal, switched sides again, and all would be forgiven. Clarence accepted. The Yorkist brothers were reunited. Warwick now faced Edward's growing army without his most important ally. The Battle of Barnet was fought on April 14, 1471, Easter Sunday, in thick fog that reduced visibility to almost nothing. The two armies crashed together in the mist, units becoming confused and disoriented. At one point, Warwick's men mistook their own allies for enemies and attacked them, causing chaos in the Lancastrian lines. The Yorkists broke through. Warwick, who had fought on foot to demonstrate his commitment to the cause, was caught trying to flee to his horse. He was killed either in combat or murdered after surrender, depending on which account you believe. The Kingmaker was dead, but the war wasn't over. Margaret of Anjou and Prince Edward had just landed in England with a fresh army. Margaret had delayed her crossing, waiting for favorable winds and news of Warwick's progress. She arrived too late. By the time she landed, Warwick was dead and Edward IV was back in control of London, but she didn't surrender. She marched west, trying to reach Wales, where she hoped to find Lancastrian supporters and regroup. Edward pursued. The two armies met at Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471. The battle was a disaster for the Lancastrians. Their army was routed. Many leaders were killed in the fighting or executed afterward. Prince Edward, the son Margaret had fought for 17 years to put on the throne, died at Tewkesbury. The exact circumstances are disputed. Some sources say he was killed in battle. Others say he was captured and brought before Edward IV, who asked him why he had invaded the realm. "I came to recover my father's inheritance," the prince supposedly replied, whereupon Edward's brothers stabbed him to death. Whatever the truth, the Lancastrian heir was dead. Margaret was captured. Her cause was destroyed. She would spend years as a prisoner before being ransomed back to France, where she died in poverty and obscurity. And on the night Edward IV returned to London in triumph, Henry VI died in the Tower. The official story was that Henry died of melancholy upon hearing of his son's death. No one believed it. Everyone assumed he had been murdered, probably by Richard of Gloucester, Edward's youngest brother, who was constable of the Tower that night. With Henry VI dead and Prince Edward dead, the Lancastrian line was effectively extinct. Edward IV was now king beyond all challenge. The war was over, for real this time, for about 12 years anyway. The second reign of Edward IV was relatively peaceful and prosperous. The king proved to be a capable administrator. He restored royal finances, promoted trade, and avoided expensive foreign wars. He was personally popular, charming. Accessible, generous to his supporters, he was also increasingly self-indulgent. The handsome warrior of the 1460s became fat and dissolute in the 1470s. He had numerous mistresses, most famously Jane Shore. He spent lavishly on his court, but the government functioned. Order was maintained. England recovered from the chaos of civil war. Edward had two sons: Edward, Prince of Wales, born in 1470, and Richard, Duke of York, born in 1473. The succession seemed secure. The Yorkist dynasty would continue. On April 9, 1483, Edward IV died unexpectedly. He was 40 years old, worn out, perhaps by his lifestyle or possibly ill from something more specific. The sources aren't clear. His son Edward was 12 years old. England once again had a child king. What happened next remains one of the most controversial episodes in English history. Edward V was at Ludlow Castle when his father died, being raised by his Woodville relatives. His uncle Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, was preparing to bring him to London for his coronation, but Edward IV's will had named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector during the young king's minority. Richard moved fast. He intercepted the Woodville escort at Stony Stratford. He arrested Earl Rivers and other Woodville supporters. He took custody of the young king. Richard claimed then and later that he was acting to protect his nephew from the Woodvilles, who were plotting to seize power for themselves. The Woodvilles claimed that Richard was plotting to seize power for himself. Both sides were probably right. Edward V was brought to London and lodged in the Tower, which was, at the time, a royal residence as well as a prison. His brother Richard was sent to join him. The coronation was scheduled, then postponed. Richard consolidated his control over the government. Woodville supporters were arrested or fled into hiding. And then, in June 1483, Richard made his move. A preacher named Ralph Shaw delivered a sermon at St. Paul's Cross declaring that Edward IV's children were illegitimate. The claim was that Edward IV had been secretly married or at least pre-contracted to marry another woman before his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. If this was true, then the Woodville marriage was invalid and the children were bastards with no claim to the throne. Was the claim true? Almost certainly not. The evidence was flimsy, based on the testimony of a single bishop who claimed to have knowledge of the pre-contract. No documentation was ever produced. But legal niceties didn't matter. What mattered was power. On June 26, 1483, Richard of Gloucester was proclaimed King Richard III. The princes Edward V and his brother Richard remained in the Tower. And then, sometime in the late summer or autumn of 1483, they disappeared. No one knows exactly what happened to the princes in the Tower. They were last seen alive in the summer of 1483, glimpsed occasionally in the Tower grounds, playing together, apparently unaware that their uncle had just stolen their throne. And then the sightings stopped. The boys simply vanished. Richard III never explained what had happened to them. He never produced them alive to refute the rumors of murder. He never announced their deaths or provided bodies for burial. The silence was deafening and damning. The most likely explanation is the simplest. Richard had them killed. As long as the princes lived, they were a threat. They were the legitimate heirs of Edward IV. Any rebellion against Richard could rally around them. Any foreign power could use them as a pretext for invasion. They had to be removed. The traditional account, recorded by Thomas More decades later, described how Richard sent a trusted servant named James Tyrrell to the Tower. Tyrrell hired to men Miles Forrest and John Dighton, who smothered the boys in their beds and buried them beneath a staircase. In 1674, workers at the Tower discovered a wooden chest containing the bones of two children, buried at the base of a staircase. The bones were assumed to be the princes and were reinterred in Westminster Abbey. Modern attempts to test the bones have been blocked, so their identity remains unconfirmed. Some historians have proposed alternative theories. Perhaps the princes were killed by Henry VII after he took the throne. Perhaps they died of natural causes. Perhaps one or both survived and escaped. None of these theories has gained widespread acceptance. The weight of evidence points to Richard III. He had the motive, the opportunity, and the cold-blooded ruthlessness demonstrated throughout his career. He had already participated in or at least condoned the murder of Henry VI. The princes were simply the next obstacles to be removed. But certainty is impossible. The mystery remains 5 centuries later, one of history's great unsolved crimes. Richard III's reign was troubled from the beginning. The manner in which he had seized power alienated many who might otherwise have supported him. He was Edward IV's brother, a proven military commander and experienced administrator. He could have been a successful king if he had come to the throne legitimately. But the usurpation and the presumed murder of his nephews created a stain that Richard could never wash away. Within months of his coronation, the first rebellion erupted. The Duke of Buckingham, one of Richard's closest allies, the man who had helped him seize power, suddenly turned against the king. The reasons are unclear. Perhaps Buckingham wanted the throne for himself. Perhaps he was horrified by the fate of the princes. Perhaps he simply saw an opportunity. Buckingham allied with an unexpected figure, Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was, to put it charitably, tenuous. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, was descended from John of Gaunt Edward III's third son through a legitimated bastard line. His father, Edmund Tudor, was the half-brother of Henry VI, but that connection was through Henry VI's mother, not through the royal bloodline itself. By any reasonable standard of succession, Henry Tudor shouldn't have been anywhere near the throne. Dozens of people had better claims, but most of those people were dead. The Wars of the Roses had slaughtered the English nobility with remarkable thoroughness. The legitimate Lancastrian line was extinct. The senior Yorkist line was extinct, or rather, locked in the Tower and presumed dead. Many of the intermediate claimants had been killed in battle, executed after battle, or attainted and stripped of their rights. Henry Tudor was what remained. He was the Lancastrian hope, the last surviving alternative to Richard III. He had been in exile since 1471, when the Lancastrian cause collapsed after Tewkesbury. He had grown up at the courts of Brittany and France, learning languages, observing politics, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. Buckingham's rebellion gave him that opportunity, or seemed to. In October 1483, Henry set sail from Brittany with a small fleet, intending to land in England and join Buckingham's uprising. But everything went wrong. Storms scattered his fleet. Buckingham's rebellion collapsed before Henry could arrive. The Duke was captured and executed. Henry sailed along the English coast, saw that the rising had failed, and returned to exile. It was a humiliating failure, but Henry had learned something valuable. Richard III was vulnerable. The king had enemies. With the right circumstances, a determined challenger might succeed. Henry began planning his next attempt. Richard III spent the next 2 years trying to consolidate his position. He made progress. He promoted capable administrators. He reformed the legal system. He cultivated support in the north of England, where he was personally popular. He tried to present himself as a legitimate king, not a usurper. But the shadow of the princes hung over everything. Elizabeth Woodville, the prince's mother, now in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, eventually made a deal with Richard. She emerged from sanctuary, accepted Richard's promises of protection for herself and her daughters, and apparently reconciled with the man she must have believed had murdered her sons. Why would she do this? Perhaps she was simply exhausted, trapped without options. Perhaps she hoped to protect her surviving children by cooperating. Perhaps, as some have speculated, she knew or suspected that the princes were still alive, which would explain her willingness to deal with Richard. We'll never know her reasoning. We only know that she made peace with her son's probable murderer. Richard also suffered a personal tragedy His only legitimate son, Edward of Middleham, died in April 1484. The boy was about 10 years old. Richard and his wife were devastated, and the succession was suddenly uncertain again. Anne herself died less than a year later. In March 1485, rumors swirled that Richard had poisoned her so he could marry his niece, Elizabeth of York Edward IV's eldest daughter, and strengthen his claim to the throne. The rumors were probably false, but they added to Richard's reputation for sinister ruthlessness. By the summer of 1485, Richard was increasingly isolated. His allies were dying or defecting. His enemies were gathering across the Channel. Henry Tudor was coming. Henry landed at Mill Bay in Wales on August 7, 1485, with a small force of French mercenaries and English exiles. It was a desperate gamble. Henry had perhaps 2,000 men. Richard had the resources of the English crown. On paper, the invasion should have been crushed within weeks, but Henry was counting on defections. He marched through Wales, gathering supporters. He sent messages to lords who might be wavering in their loyalty to Richard. He promised rewards, titles, pardons for past offenses. He presented himself as a liberator come to free England from a tyrant. Richard, meanwhile, was gathering his forces at Nottingham. When he learned of Henry's landing, he summoned his vassals and prepared for battle. The two armies met at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire on August 22, 1485. The Battle of Bosworth was not a large engagement by the standards of the Wars of the Roses. Richard had perhaps 8,000 men. Henry had perhaps 5,000. But the battle would be decided not by numbers, but by treachery. The key figures were the Stanleys Thomas, Lord Stanley, and his brother William. The Stanleys commanded a large force, perhaps 4,000 men, positioned on the flanks of the battlefield. They were officially loyal to Richard, but Thomas Stanley was married to Henry Tudor's mother, Margaret Beaufort. Richard didn't trust the Stanleys. He had taken Thomas Stanley's son hostage to ensure the family's loyalty. But hostages only work if you're willing to kill them, and Richard hesitated to execute the son of a man whose army he needed. The Stanleys waited. They watched. They kept their options open. The battle began in the morning. Richard's forces held the high ground. Henry's vanguard, commanded by the Earl of Oxford, advanced uphill against the royal army. The fighting was fierce but inconclusive, and then Richard saw an opportunity. Henry Tudor was positioned apart from his main army, surrounded by only a small bodyguard. If Richard could kill Henry personally, the invasion would collapse. The Pretender's supporters would scatter. The war would be over. Richard led a cavalry charge directly at Henry. It was a bold move, reckless, even. But Richard was a warrior. He had fought in battle since his teenage years. He knew that wars were won by decisive action, not by caution. The charge almost succeeded. Richard's cavalry smashed through Henry's bodyguard. Richard himself killed Henry's standard bearer. He came within feet of Henry Tudor, close enough to strike, and then the Stanleys moved. William Stanley's forces crashed into Richard's cavalry from the flank. The royal charge disintegrated. Richard was surrounded, cut off from his army, fighting for his life. He was offered a horse to escape. He refused. "I will not flee," he supposedly said. "I will die King of England." And he did. Richard III was the last English king to die in battle. He was hacked down in the melee, his crown of gold circlet worn over his helmet trolling away into a thorn bush. Thomas Stanley retrieved the crown and placed it on Henry Tudor's head. Henry VII was King of England. The Battle of Bosworth ended the Wars of the Roses, or at least, it ended the main conflict. Henry VII moved quickly to consolidate his position. He dated his reign from the day before Bosworth, allowing him to declare Richard's supporters traitors and confiscate their lands. He imprisoned potential rivals and executed the most dangerous. He married Elizabeth of York Edward IV's daughter, uniting the Lancastrian and Yorkist claims in their children. The Tudor rose red and white combined became the symbol of the new dynasty, but threats remained. In 1487, a pretender named Lambert Simnel appeared, claiming to be the Earl of Warwick, a Yorkist prince who was actually imprisoned in the tower. Simnel was probably a puppet, manipulated by Yorkist diehards who hoped to overthrow Henry. They even crowned him Edward VI in Dublin. Henry defeated Simnel's supporters at the Battle of Stokefield. The pretender was captured and, in a surprising display of clemency, was put to work in the royal kitchens. He eventually became a falconer. A more dangerous pretender emerged in the 1490s, Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York the younger of the two princes in the Tower. Warbeck gathered international support, was recognized by several foreign courts, and launched multiple invasion attempts before being captured and eventually executed. These challenges demonstrated how fragile Henry VII's position remained. The Wars of the Roses had created a culture of rebellion, where pretenders and claimants could emerge from anywhere, backed by foreign powers or disgruntled nobles. Henry responded with a combination of ruthlessness and cunning. He neutralized potential threats through imprisonment, execution, and forced marriages. He built up the royal treasury, making the crown financially independent of the nobility. He created a network of informers and enforcers that made conspiracy dangerous. By the time Henry VII died in 1509, he had succeeded in doing what no one had done for a century. He had established a stable dynasty that would rule England for over 100 years. The Wars of the Roses killed somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people, a staggering toll for a country with a population of perhaps 3 million. The English nobility was decimated. Of the 60 or so noble families that existed in 1450, about half were extinct or attainted by 1500. The great lords who had defied kings and made and unmade governments were replaced by new men, creatures of the Tudor monarchy, dependent on royal favor for their position. The old feudal order was dying. The bastard feudalism that had allowed nobles to maintain private armies, the livery and maintenance system that had made civil war possible, was gradually suppressed. The Tudors would build a different kind of state, more centralized, more bureaucratic, less dependent on the military power of independent lords. The political culture changed too. After a century of conflict, the English had developed a horror of civil war and a desperate desire for stability. They would tolerate much from their kings, including Henry VIII's break with Rome and his execution of 2 wives, rather than risk another descent into chaos. The memory of the Wars of the Roses shaped English politics for generations. Shakespeare's history plays, written a century after Bosworth, presented the wars as a divine punishment for the original sin of deposing Richard II. The Tudor myth, the idea that the Tudors had rescued England from chaos and restored divine order, became the official interpretation of history. That interpretation was propaganda, of course. The Tudors had their own reasons for demonizing their predecessors, but it contained a kernel of truth. The Wars of the Roses really had been a catastrophe, and the Tudor settlement really did bring stability. What caused the Wars of the Roses? Historians have proposed many answers. The weakness of Henry VI, the ambition of Richard of York, the legacy of the Lancastrian usurpation, the economic disruptions caused by the end of the 100 Years' War, the culture of violence among the English nobility. All of these factors played a role, but perhaps the deepest cause was structural. The English political system had no mechanism for resolving disputes over the succession. When a king died without a clear heir, or when the heir was a child, or when the heir was challenged by someone with a competing claim, there was no peaceful way to determine who should rule. The only options were negotiation, which required good faith on all sides, or war. The system depended on everyone agreeing on who the legitimate king was. When that agreement broke down, when multiple claimants existed, each with armed supporters, civil war became almost inevitable. The Tudors didn't solve this problem. Henry VIII's obsessive quest for a male heir, which led him to break with Rome and marry 6 times, was driven by fear of another succession crisis. The question of who would succeed Elizabeth I dominated the final decades of her reign, but the Tudors did establish a precedent of stable succession that the Stuarts would build on. The Wars of the Roses were not repeated. England would have civil wars again. The English Civil War of the 1640s was arguably worse, but not dynastic wars of the same character. The age of rival royal houses fighting for the crown was over. Let me end with the two boys in the tower. Edward and Richard were 12 and 9 when they disappeared. They had done nothing wrong. They were guilty only of being their father's sons, of standing between an ambitious uncle and the throne he craved. We don't know their final moments. We don't know if they understood what was happening to them, if they were afraid, if they called for help that never came. We know only that they vanished, and that their disappearance left a wound in English history that has never fully healed. Richard III has had his defenders over the centuries. Some historians argue that he was a capable ruler, unfairly maligned by Tudor propaganda. Some argue that the princes might have been killed by someone else, or might have survived in hiding. The Richard III Society has worked for decades to rehabilitate his reputation, but the rehabilitation has limits. The discovery of Richard's skeleton under a Leicester parking lot in 2012, confirmed through DNA testing, generated enormous interest. The reburial in Leicester Cathedral was a major event, but it didn't answer the fundamental questions. What happened to the princes? Who ordered their deaths? Where are their bodies? 500 years of investigation have produced no definitive answers. In a sense, that mystery is appropriate. The Wars of the Roses were full of mysteries, of secret deals and hidden motives, of people who switched sides and others who disappeared at convenient moments. The conflict was not a simple story of good versus evil, Lancaster versus York, but a tangled web of ambition and betrayal where everyone had blood on their hands. The princes were the last victims of that bloody age. Children sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. Innocents caught in a Game of Thrones they never asked to play. Their story has no ending because we don't know how it ended. We can only imagine two boys, alone in the tower, waiting for a fate they couldn't escape. George R.R. Martin has acknowledged that the Wars of the Roses inspired A Song of Ice and Fire, the novels that became Game of Thrones. The parallels are obvious: rival houses fighting for a throne, complex family trees, betrayals and reversals, violence that spares no one. But the real Wars of the Roses needed no dragons or magic to be dramatic. The reality was dramatic enough. A king who went mad, a queen who would stop at nothing to protect her son, a kingmaker who made and unmade monarchs at will, battles fought in snowstorms and fog, princes murdered in prison, a hunchbacked king killed in a desperate cavalry charge. These things actually happened. Real people lived them and died in them. The Wars of the Roses remind us that history is not a story we tell for entertainment. It's a record of actual human beings making choices under impossible pressure, trying to survive in a world where power was the only protection and weakness meant death. The people who fought these wars were not heroes or villains, or rather, they were both, depending on when you caught them. Edward IV was a brilliant warrior who became a lazy, self-indulgent king. Warwick was a kingmaker who couldn't stop making kings even when it destroyed him. Richard III may have been a murderer, but he was also a courageous soldier who refused to flee when he could have escaped. They were human beings, complicated and contradictory, doing what they believed they had to do. And in the end, most of them died for it. The throne survived. England survived. The Tudor dynasty rose from the ashes and built a nation that would one day rule an empire. But the cost was paid in blood, the blood of kings and commoners, of warriors and children, of everyone caught in the grinding machinery of civil war. The Wars of the Roses ended. The wounds they left behind took centuries to heal. Some of them never healed at all.